Teisha Bader, and in the news, a recent survey of American Jews on their feelings about anti-Semitism and Israel. The first such survey since Israel's conflict with terror group Hamas in Gaza. The survey yielded some disturbing results. Washington bureau chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Ron Kampeas, wrote an article about the survey, and he is kind enough to join us now from Arlington, Virginia, here on JBS. Ron, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So let's just talk a bit first about the group that commissioned the survey, the Jewish Electorate Institute. What can you tell us about them?
It's a group that's headed by, I would say, mainstream pro-Israel Democrats. They're Democrats. They fundraise for the Democratic Party. They are affiliated to a degree with the Jewish Democratic Council of America, which is kind of the place it's in. It's not happy with the far left of the party, but it's certainly very much a partisan group. And I think the aim of this survey is just to assess. It's like a lot of, even though they call themselves nonpartisan, it's like a lot of partisan surveys. It has value because they're trying to figure out how to appeal to their constituency, and they take on a reputable pollster to carry out the survey, and the work that they do is aimed at figuring out how to pitch their, how to build up their constituency and how to reach Jews who might not be in exactly the same corner that they are politically.
So yes, they called the poll a national profile that's meant to give a national profile of the Jewish electorate for this year. And they asked 800 voters, pretty much split evenly between men and women. Seems to be most of those asked identify as Reform, about 37%, 31% non-denominational, and then we have 17% conservative Jews, and 9% Orthodox, and 2% Reconstructionist. Also, just want to note, the people who were asked were between the ages of 18 and 65, and 61 say they are Democrats. So it's a heavily Democratic group.
Right, and that reflects, and that reflects, that reflects every other survey that we've had. Jews tend to vote Democratic. The numbers in there are absolutely commensurate, for instance, with the American Jewish Committee's polling, recent polling in June of last year. There's nothing surprising in how in those numbers. That's not where the surprise came.
Right. So we're going to get to the surprise, or depending how you look at it, in just a minute. So there are questions that are just in general asking people how they feel President Joe Biden is doing in his role, how they feel he's doing as far as his relations with Israel and in the light of the recent conflict. Nothing too surprising there, I wouldn't say. Am I correct?
Right. He gets 80% approval for overall, or he gets 80% on his job rating and 70% approval. And don't ask me ever to explain that. There are always differences in those two numbers in polling. But like I said, those are absolutely commensurate with other polling. And he gets, I think, 64% approval for how he handled the recent conflict, and 70% approval for how he's handling Israel relations overall, or thereabouts. And like I said, that's typical. The one interesting little wrinkle I'd note here, is that among Orthodox Jews, you find usually in these polls, and this is reflected here, is that the equation is usually flipped for Orthodox Jews. They're more Republican. He gets 30% approval, 31% approval among Orthodox Jews generally, but 44% for how he handles Israel relations, that's a kind of a little surprise, not as big as a surprise you're going to talk about, but that's a little surprise that he's doing very well relatively well among Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. So then the survey gets to those who were asked about their feelings about anti-Semitism and about Israel. So one of the questions, before we get to the other ones, is can you be critical of Israel and pro-Israel at the same time? And a very large amount, 87% said yes, you absolutely can be. Was there any surprise there for you?
No, that's also commensurate with recent polling, including, I think, by the same pollster when he worked for J Street, a group that considers itself pro-Israel but also critical of Israel. And I think also Gallup has asked that kind of question in the past, and so it's absolutely commensurate with those numbers. Not a surprise.
Yeah, yeah, and the same pretty much. There seemed to be general support for the U.S. giving aid to Israel. That changed slightly when they asked about restricting aid, but for the most part, there was a relatively high support rate for U.S. aid to Israel.
Right.
What got interesting was when they asked more specific questions about what constitutes anti-Semitism. We should first just say that 90% of those surveyed said they are concerned to varying degrees about anti-Semitism in the U.S., which is quite a high number.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's commensurate with what we've seen recently, the spike in anti-Semitic incidents that came after the Gaza conflict in May. I think over the last 4 years, at least certainly, possibly since the Charlottesville March in 2017 with the neo-Nazis, but certainly since the killing in Pittsburgh in 2018, you've seen a spike in concern among Jewish Americans about the threat of anti-Semitism, and that was more pronounced because of the attacks on Jews that followed this conflict in New York, in Los Angeles. People at a restaurant were assaulted. In New York, there were attacks in the street. That's absolutely not surprising. 90%.
Yes. So then it gets very specific about providing several statements to those taking the survey, and their response to the statement was either supposed to be, do you agree? Do you disagree? And if you disagree, is the statement anti-Semitic? So the first statement, and perhaps also we can talk about the wording of the statement. The first statement is Israel doesn't have the right to exist. Israel does not have the right to exist. That is the first statement, which, again, they could have asked it maybe in several different ways. I don't know how you feel about that, but I want to talk about the responses. Most people disagreed. In other words, agreed that Israel has the right to exist. However, the amount of people that agreed with the statement that Israel does not have the right to exist, 9%, which is, if my math is correct, about 72 people out of the 800.
Right. And the margin of error is 3.5% either way, so that could be as little as 6%. Or even less than 6%. But yeah, that's correct. That there are, and that number rises when you go to people who are under 40. And yeah, that's shocking. That is shocking what was also interesting, I think, was that in terms of the 5 statements that were put out, and there was there were 4 that you could identify with the left, 1 that you could identify with the right. That was the only one where you had an overwhelming majority. I think 67% agree that it's anti-Semitic. So you have that surprising 9%, but you also have consensus, I think, or close to consensus, that it's also an anti-Semitic statement. That's definitely still a view among Jews. And what I'd like to know is how that comports or how that fits in with the general population. To what degree do people generally would view that statement as being anti-Semitic? That's interesting as well.
And
also,
perhaps,
go ahead.
I was going to just add to what you're saying, perhaps also how many in the general population agree with the statement, which is the most disturbing thing. Again, 9%, like you said, maybe it's 6, maybe it's less than the 9, but you're still talking about American Jews who apparently believe that Israel has no right to exist. I personally found that, as you did, quite shocking, and I'm not sure what we do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. What do you do? I'm just writing a story now. I'm finishing it on, what are the failures in education that led us to this period? And there are all sorts of answers. I think that, I don't know if you want to go on to some of the other questions, but I could also found that I think 25%, 1/4 of the people agreed that Israel is an apartheid state.
And that is, yes, and that is, again, just truly something that has to be looked at very closely. What was your initial response to reading that?
Well, I think that what's happened is you've had apartheid come into the lexicon. And one of the people I spoke to, Sharon Nazarian, who's the who's a senior vice president at the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, talked about this, how it's, the strategy of the Jewish community until recently, has been to say these views are marginal. Don't deal with them, ignore them, put them aside. But maybe they have to deal with them now because they've been mainstreamed. They've been mainstreamed in part because of the coverage of the May conflict. They've been mainstreamed in part because of the whole way that Americans have come to understand institutionalized racism in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the agitation here for greater rights for blacks. And the biggest surprise number was, I think, 34% of respondents thought that the way that Israel treated Palestinians is the same thing as the way that Americans treat black people. And so that's where you get the mainstreaming of this. And I think also, people brought this up, there's a lack of understanding, or lack of consensus on what apartheid means. And so and that came out recently as Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights group, both said that Israel was practicing apartheid. And then if you looked at both groups, which is shocking because apartheid, as we understand it, is commonly understood, is an ideologically racist worldview. South African apartheid held that blacks were inferior, and there's nothing like that constitutionally in Israel. There's nothing in Israel that holds that any non-Jewish entity is inferior or to be treated in a less way. And in fact, of course, Israel's Declaration of Independence upholds equality. And so what they did was they pointed to something that I hadn't known existed until this happened. Some international body declared that apartheid could also mean treating a class of people as without not giving them the same rights. And so you applied that to the Palestinians and the territories. But that's not a subtle difference. That's a huge difference. And whatever one thinks of how Israel treats the Palestinians and the territories, removing from the definition of apartheid the racist component is a massive issue. And so now perhaps you have a lot of people who don't understand, who understand apartheid as not necessarily being racist, and they're willing to apply it to the Israel situation. And so there's a massive area for education, like why. What apartheid means, what do you think apartheid means, and why do you think it applies to Israel? And maybe we can, the Jewish community can address that.
Absolutely. I mean, again, we're saying 25% answered that they agree that Israel is an apartheid state. Shocking. And I would venture to say, I don't know these people, but I am guessing that many of them, as you said, do not understand the meaning of apartheid, do not know what it means, have just heard it thrown around, have heard the accusation, whether it's by the media or social media, and they just buy into it. And they're like, oh, if that's what people are saying, that must be what Israel's doing. That must be the case. That must be true. You spoke also about sort of this co-opting of the issue of racism in America. And again, people just saying, well, if someone so-and-so is saying that Israel is acting in a racist manner towards the Palestinians, and it's similar to the way there's racism in America, that must be true. Because we're on that side. We're on the side of justice, and that must be true. So I feel like, I wonder, and I wish they would have asked in the survey, have you ever been to Israel? Because for me, I really feel that I would be surprised if those people who called Israel apartheid had been to Israel. Maybe a small number, but I feel like being in Israel, being on the ground, seeing people of different religions, ethnicities, Israelis, Arabs, so many ethnic groups walking down the street together, working together, serving in the Knesset together, being part of the current governing coalition of the State of Israel. That was not happening in apartheid South Africa. So it's an interesting, I wish they would have asked, have you ever been to Israel? And I just also wonder, as you were saying, how much of this opinion just comes from things that are heard, things that are accused of Israel, things that are heard on social media, as opposed to someone saying, I'm really going to look into this issue. I think I'll do some research. I think I'll look into this deeper. Right.
And I think that, one of the, I can give you a kind of a little mini scoop here. I got the crosstabs for from the pollster just today on some of the questions. And what was interesting to me, I didn't find, we don't know, as you said, we don't know who has been to Israel among the respondents. But what was very interesting to me was that you had among the people who said they felt that they had a real emotional attachment to Israel, that there were numbers among them who agreed with these statements, who also had, like, so 19% of people who were emotionally attached to Israel agreed with the statement that Israel is an apartheid state. So, like, that speaks to real confusion, I think, among some of the respondents.
Absolutely.
I mean, and I was going to say that if you are a pro-Israel Jewish organization, the glass half full is that you can reach those people. I think that you can still talk to those people, and maybe there's a better way of reaching those people. I mean, a lot of the people I was interviewing today for this article were saying, don't marginalize these people. If they're coming and they're saying, well, I think Israel's an apartheid state, don't necessarily count them out. Don't call them anti-Semitic. Don't put a cherem on them, to use the term meaning communication in Hebrew. Talk to them, engage with them. So that I thought that was interesting as well.
I agree. I think that's so important, and clearly 25% is not a margin, is not something that can be dismissed on that one question, even if it's 9%, even if it's 6%. I agree with you. And that leads to the question, so where does the responsibility lie? Is it Hasbara, how Israel sort of expresses itself and explains to diaspora Jewry or to the world in general what it's doing, what its policies are? Is it Jewish educators here in the U.S., as you mentioned something earlier? Where do we kind of turn to say, okay, we need to do a better job at showing the reality on the ground?
That's a great question, and I think that it's just one for the ages. I mean, it's the difficulties in Jewish education. I mean, one of the Sharon Nazarian who I was speaking to said over the last 7 years, she also leads a foundation on education. She says people in Jewish education have been talking about maybe not depicting Israel as a nirvana, as like a paradise on earth in Jewish education, talking about its flaws as a means of stemming the grotesque caricatures that sometimes come from anti-Israel actors. And it's completely anecdotal, but I like to tell the story of my niece who did Birthright in Israel. And she was 26. She was a master's student, very intelligent young woman. Not that I'm bragging, but I am. But she went and she did Birthright, and she kind of resented the propaganda that she got at Birthright. But then she spent another 3 weeks, which you're allowed to do on Birthright. And she went and she saw my family in Israel, my extended family, and that sold her on Israel. It's like, and just the warmth, not just the warmth that she got, but the diversity of views, the arguments that she heard, the history that she heard. So I think that sometimes, I don't know. I can't lend my family to every Birthright person that comes to Israel. But I think that, maybe a more diverse, a more nuanced, a more attachment to Israel is where maybe the answer lies.
And that's a really interesting point because, as you said, Israel is not a perfect society. It has its problems. It has its issues, just like the United States. And as we started with at the beginning of the conversation, such a huge majority of those who took the survey said they can absolutely be pro-Israel and be critical of Israel. And you can be critical of Israel. I think the point of our discussion is wanting the people who have that wanting to know if they've been educated, if they've learned about the subject, or if they're just really picking up on things that they're hearing and lopping all these issues into one, as opposed to talking to Israelis or finding out more, just having conversations and being open to what was behind the conflict with Gaza. Mm-hmm. How long have Israelis been living under rocket fire? What is the reality? What does that mean when you have 7 seconds to get to a bomb shelter? And again, not trying to, as you said, paint a picture of a nirvana, but to paint a picture that is based in reality, that is based in fact, and just to be a little more open-minded and, coming to your own conclusions rather than saying, well, so-and-so said Israel's an apartheid state or Israel's committing genocide, so that must be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I told you the people who were sponsoring this, and like the press releases went out. 80% of Jewish Americans think that Joe Biden's doing a great job, blah, blah, blah. And I was the one reporter who actually looked into the survey, and I found a very different headline, because that headline wasn't that interesting to me. So it's not as if, I can't blame the people in this survey for not diving a little deeper when they got those questions. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that there needs to be research now as to what degree the people who answer the questions, who agree that Israel's an apartheid state, who agree that Israel's committing genocide, who agree that Israel shouldn't exist, what kind of education did they have? That's what would really be interesting. And find out what in their education led them to those kinds of views, or is it more? Was it really coming a lot from just social media? I mean, David Harris, the president of the CEO of the American Jewish Committee, whom I spoke with about this, he says a lot of the problems really is, younger people getting their information from social media, which is just it's a petri dish for distortions, as we know. And that's his speculation. I think it's probably intelligent and informed speculation, but I'd like to see more data going into that.
Absolutely. So are you following up any further on this research? I know you said you're writing another article now.
Yeah, just the story that I wrote right now. I think we're not going to let it go. I think this is just too interesting to let go right now. It's too critical. It's not just interesting. It's critical to understanding the American Jewish community and how one keeps the American Jewish community engaged.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, thank you so much for writing your piece in the JTA. You do a wonderful job, and we appreciate your input, your responses, and helping us better understand this survey.
Anytime, sure. I'm always happy to appear on JBS. It's great.
Thank you so much. Ron Kampeas is the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and we thank him so much for his time here today, joining us on JBS. And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Golub, technical manager, Michael Paley, our transmissions director, John McDevitt, and producer, Carol Lilienthal. And thank you so much for joining us on In the News.